Good morning, everyone. Just as another announcement, this room is for the presentation on R2, T4, and credit hours. If you were here for the other presentation, that has gotten moved over to the other building. For those who are here for this, welcome, and we're glad that you found our new location. My name is Scott Filter, and I'm from the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and with me today is David Musser from the Office of the Planning Liaison and Implementation Office at Federal Student Aid. All right. Can you hear me now? Back of the room? Wave if you can hear me. All right, I get some thumbs up. Thank you. So here is today's agenda, and we'll give you a couple seconds to read that agenda before we jump right into our presentation. So Title IV funds are awarded to a student with the assumption that the student will attend school for the entire period for which the assistance is awarded. When a student ceases attendance prior to the planned ending date, the student may not be eligible for the full amount of Title IV funds the student was scheduled to receive. This is the underlying principle in Section 484, capital B in the Higher Education Act. When you and your colleagues award Title IV federal student aid and a student ceases enrollment prior to the planned ending date, the institution is charged with the responsibility of calculating the earned and unearned amounts of aid and following the requirements of the statute's implementing regulations in 34 CFR 668.22. And now I'm going to provide some additional basic principles related to R2T4. As you can see from the first bullet, Title IV funds are earned on the basis of seat time, or the number of days the student has attended. So when calculating an R2T4, there are mathematically only three possibilities. As in the second bullet, the student has withdrawn just at that point where the amount dispersed equals the amount earned. If this happens after you complete that R2T4 calculation, since this is your lucky day, you should go buy a lottery ticket and enjoy retirement in the south of France. In the third bullet, the school has dispersed more than what the student has earned, so the unearned portion must be returned. And in the final bullet, the student has earned more than what has been dispersed, therefore a post-withdrawal disbursement is required to be offered consistent with the requirements of 34 CFR 668.22a. And while I indicated earlier that students earn their Title IV funds based on seat time, that is true up to a point as shown in the initial bullet on this screen. Once the student has completed more than 60%, and please note that that's more than 60%, not just 60%, of the payment period or the period of enrollment, then the student has earned 100% of the Title IV funds. Institutional or other refund policies, such as those from your state or accrediting agency, do not impact the amount of Title IV aid earned under an R2T4 calculation. And later in this presentation, we will go into more details about the difference between institutions that are required to take attendance and those not required to do so. However, the point I want to stress here is that it is always okay for schools to use the best information available to determine the withdrawal date. For example, if you have an instructor that always takes attendance, not because he's required to do so by the institution, but rather because he knows more students will show up for class, required or not, those attendance records are among the most accurate for withdrawal determination, which is always the goal. So use the best data available. As you will see later on, there are a myriad of timed activities required on the institutional staff in order to complete all the required tasks. Among them are what's listed on this slide. An institution must determine the date of the student's withdrawal, calculate the percent of the period completed by the student, determine the amount earned by applying the percent completed to the total of amounts dispersed and amounts that could have been dispersed, return the unearned funds to Title IV programs or pay the student a post-withdrawal disbursement, and determine if there's any Title IV overpayment. The requirements of 34 CFR 668.43 provide that institutions must provide consumer information to enrolled students, as well as prospective students regarding R2T4 and other refund policies established by the state, accreditor, and institution. Students should be provided with an understanding of the interplay among these various refund policies and their net effect. For example, when a student ceases attendance early, some of the federal student aid that would have paid their bill may be determined to be unearned and must be paid back to the government, such as in the case of a first-time, first-year student who withdraws prior to the end of the 30-day delayed direct loan disbursement date. So how will that unpaid bill be handled? What are the student's options at your institution? That's the type of consumer information that we mean here. Under the provisions of 34 CFR 668.21, if a student never begins attending classes, then the R2T4 does not apply. Instead, all of the Title IV funds must be returned due to the fact that the student never established eligibility for those funds. So now let's take a closer look at how the R2T4 calculation is performed by taking it apart piece by piece. Here in step 1, the institution determines the precise amounts of Title IV aid for which a student was eligible at the time of the withdrawal, including the amounts that were dispersed and amounts that could have been dispersed. In step 2, the institution calculates the percentage of the period that was completed. Please note, as I said earlier, that if it was greater than 60%, the student earns 100% for that period. The numerator here is the number of days that was attended or completed in that period, and the denominator are the total number of days in the period. Please note also that refers to days in the period, that could either be the payment period or the period of enrollment. The payment period is always used when a program is taught on a standard term basis, and the period of enrollment may be used when the program is taught in a non-term credit hour format or as a non-standard term format. So then you take the percentage calculated in step 2, item H, and multiply it by the total amount of Title IV aid that was dispersed or could have been dispersed, which is determined in step 1, item G, to yield the product or amount of aid earned here in step 3, item I. And then again, we're back to what we discussed earlier, that there are 3 possibilities. The amount earned is greater than the amount dispersed, in which case a post-withdrawal disbursement is required. The amount earned is less than the amount dispersed, in which case a return is required. Or the amount dispersed is the amount earned are equal, so enjoy your retirement. In step 5, if a return is required, the institution determines the amount of unearned Title IV funds that it is required to return. The amount of funds due from the institution is calculated by adding all of the institutional charges incurred by the withdrawal date, then multiplying that total by the percentage of the period the student did not complete. And note here that you're doing a comparison to choose the lesser of the result in box K versus box N. This is a protection for the institution. Otherwise, there would be situations where the institution owed more than it had received. In step 6, once the institution determines the total amount of unearned Title IV aid that must be returned to the department, the institution must return those funds in the statutory order. The total number of days in an institution's payment period or period of enrollment constitutes the denominator of the R2T4 calculation. Total days excludes scheduled breaks of 5 days or more, and the total days also excludes leaves of absences and periods in which a student was not enrolled in any modules. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide of my notes, I apologize. So, stepping back, remaining steps. Once the institution has determined the amounts of each type of unearned Title IV aid that must be returned, any remaining unearned funds that were dispersed are the responsibility of the student. So for any Title IV funds that remain unearned, they must be repaid by the student in accordance with the loan terms, and no further action is required by you to return those funds. Remaining unearned Title IV grant funds, if greater than 50% of the total grant assistance dispersed for the period, are considered grant overpayments, and the institution must notify the student within 45 days of his or her obligation to repay those funds. That's super important because the student may be ineligible for future financial aid until those grant overpayments are taken care of. Some notes to note about rounding rules. You would calculate there to 4 decimal places, so 9 days divided by 103 days equals 0.0873. Then you round to the 3rd decimal place, which becomes 0.087 or 8.7%. And remember to round up at 5 or more, so 0.2445 becomes 0.245 or 24.5%. These rounding rules are specifically important as the top 3 or 4 issues that we often see in program reviews relate to R2T4 errors, specifically things related similarly to here, the rounding rule calculations. And back to what I was saying. The total number of days in an institution's payment period or period of enrollment constitutes the denominator in the R2T4 calculation. Those total days, again, excludes the 5 days or more scheduled breaks by your institution and leave of absences in periods in which the student was not enrolled in any modules. This exclusion for institutionally scheduled breaks of 5 or more consecutive days and the exclusion for approved leaves of absences are excluded from both the numerator and the denominator. If a withdrawal occurs after an institutionally scheduled break, such as those published in your catalogs, then that break would also be excluded from the numerator and the denominator. While we mentioned this earlier, institutions are going to overwhelmingly choose to perform their R2T4 calculations on a payment period basis. In fact, the only time where it would be likely that a period of enrollment would be used would be in the following scenario. An institution has a lockstep program where each successive module is built upon the preceding modules and where talented students may only ever withdraw near the end of the coursework due to the level of difficulty. In this type of situation, the few students who do not finish have completed more than 60% of their enrollment and therefore have earned 100% of their Title IV aid. So here's a quick graphical representation of the difference between a payment period and a period of enrollment. As you can see, the period of enrollment essentially has those 2 payment periods together. And here are some examples to illustrate the difference between the two. In example 1 here, the student leaves after 23 days in the first term of a 2-term academic year. So as you can see under the payment period, they've completed 23 days of a 100-day payment period, thereby earning 23%. The total aid that was dispersed or could have been dispersed is $2,000, so they've earned $460 and therefore did not earn $1,540. If you use the period of enrollment in this example, then you would include that second payment period as part of that period of enrollment to have 200 total days, still completing 23 days, therefore they've earned 11.5% of their Title IV aid. Again, there you'd be adding the other payment periods, Title IV aid of dispersed aid or could have been dispersed aid for $4,000, thereby reflecting that they've still earned $460, but increasing that amount that was not earned to $3,540. By contrast, see what happens here. The student leaves after 21 days in the second term of that 2-term academic year. So in that payment period, you're still looking at that 100 days because we're in that second payment period, and they've completed 21 days, thereby earning 21%. They still have that $2,000 of Title IV aid that was dispersed or could have been dispersed, showing that in this example, they've earned $420, not earning $1,580. However, when you look at the number of days completed under the period of enrollment, you would add in that other payment period to that period of enrollment, thereby showing that they've completed 121 days in the 200 days period of enrollment, showing that they've earned 60.5% of their aid. And as we said before, if you've earned over 60%, you've earned 100% of your aid. They had, again, the total Title IV aid that was dispersed or could have been dispersed of $4,000, and they have earned all of that. And as we said before, institutionally scheduled breaks of 5 days or more that are consecutive are excluded from both the numerator and the denominator. And those breaks of less than 5 consecutive days are not excluded, but included in the R2T4 calculation. An example of this would be if an institution has a vacation break beginning Wednesday, November 26th and ending Friday, November 28th, basically a Thanksgiving vacation, and the institution does not offer classes on the weekend. Therefore, those 5 days from November 26th through November 30th would be excluded from the R2T4 calculation. And now I'll turn it over to David.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Can everybody hear me in the back? I just want to be sure. Great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about leave of absences. And so a leave of absence, as you recall from a few slides ago, is important because a student on a leave of absence, while he's not attending, is not actually considered withdrawn. And all the days in the leave of absence are excluded from both the numerator and the denominator of the calculation. So essentially it's giving a student a break after which the student is expected to return and continue on his or her program as if nothing had changed. So let's take a look at the requirements for leaves of absence. In 634 CFR 668.22D, you can see here on the second bullet the conditions for an approved LOA are formal written policy. The student actually follows that policy. There's a reasonable expectation that the student returns from the leave of absence. The school approves the leave of absence in accordance with its policy, and the student is not charged any additional isn't charged anything additional for being on the leave of absence. The number of days in the leave of absence does not exceed 180 days, and loan recipients must be told about the effects on their grace period if they don't return. So an institution doesn't treat the LOA as a withdrawal, and if an LOA doesn't meet all these conditions, the school does have to consider them a withdrawal. So even if you think you're putting a student on a leave of absence, if it doesn't meet all of these requirements, an auditor or a program reviewer could come in and say that was really a withdrawal and you should have returned funds at the time that the student left. So it's very important that you take a careful look at how your leave of absence policies are structured. So for standard or non-standard term programs, the student must resume training at the same point the student began the leave of absence. So there's some stumbling blocks for term-based institutions. In those kinds of cases, a student returning from the leave of absence has to be able to pick up that coursework exactly where they left off. So for example, if you imagine a student who dropped out in the fall term, they were midway through the term, they're taking 2 classes, English and math, and they drop out and you want to put them on a leave of absence, you have to be able to ensure that in the spring when they plan to return, there's an English and a math class, it's exactly the same class, and they can resume those classes exactly where they left off in the prior term. So it's unusual actually that institutions are able to meet these requirements, but it does happen, and we know that some institutions have done that even in term-based programs. But that's the requirement for a term-based program. On the other hand, for non-term credit hour programs, the student does not have to begin training at the same point that they actually began the leave of absence. They simply have to restart, at the point that they come back. So the difference in treatment is tied to the fact that in a standard term or non-standard term program, a student must be permitted to return and actually start up again, because that's the notion behind leaves of absence in general. We expect that the student is able to restart their coursework as if nothing had stopped. In a non-term credit hour program, students are held to a standard for receiving additional disbursements of Title IV aid. They have to complete half of the credit hours and half of the weeks of instruction in the academic year. So it doesn't matter as much when they come back or if they're able to start the exact same coursework, but it makes a lot more difference for standard term programs. So that helps explain the difference in treatment. So now I want to talk a little bit about withdrawal date, which is one of the most important components of your return of Title IV calculation. The withdrawal date determines the number of days that the student is considered to have completed in the payment period and helps determine the numerator of the R2T4 calculation. Completed days does exclude all scheduled breaks of 5 days or more, and as we just discussed, completed days also excludes leaves of absence, and it also excludes periods in which the student was not enrolled in any modules. So one very important component to the withdrawal date is whether your institution is required to take attendance. And really, for the purposes of determining a withdrawal date, there are only 2 types of institutions. Institutions that are required to take attendance and institutions that are not. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences in just a moment. So an institution is required to take attendance if one of these main bullets applies. An institution is required to take attendance if an outside entity requires that attendance be taken. An institution that is required to take attendance if it has its own requirement that instructors take attendance. So this is a complex one, so I want to dig in a little bit more on this one. This could be at the institutional level. You could have an institutional policy that all faculty are required to take attendance. This could be at the department level, where a specific academic department, could be nursing, something like that, requires that all their faculty take attendance. Or it could be at the program level. A specific, very specific program has a requirement that students take attendance for some reason. If any of those are true, then the students in that program, department, or institution, depending on what the policy is, are going to be, if they drop out, your institution will be considered required to take attendance when you complete the R2T4 calculation for those students. But one important note, if a faculty member independently chooses to take attendance, and even if most of your faculty independently choose to take attendance, but your institution does not require it, then you are not an institution required to take attendance for this reason. You would not be considered required to take attendance because you have an institutional policy, because in that case there's no policy, your faculty are just doing it of their own accord, which is fine. And in fact, if they do that, it may give you better documentation for identifying the withdrawal date, but you're not required to be taking attendance in that case. The other option is that an outside entity has a requirement that can only be met by taking attendance. So in some cases, outside entities have requirements for sitting in a certain number of hours, and you could only know if a student is sitting in a certain number of hours if you take attendance every day. So that's one of those ways that you might be required to take attendance. So an institution could be considered required to take attendance for a subset of students, as I mentioned. So for example, an outside agency provides a scholarship for just 10 students, and they require that attendance be taken for those 10 students. If one of those students withdraws, then you are considered required to take attendance for that student and when you complete the RT4 calculation. Another example, you could be considered required to take attendance only for a short period of time. So for example, a state requires a continuous attendance taking for the first 10 days of class for a state grant. And in that case, if a resident withdraws within the first 10 days, then the required to take attendance rules apply. So another question, because that actually usually raises a bunch of other questions, and this is one that we want to help answer for you. Even though if you take attendance for a short period, you are considered to be attendance taking during that period, a census date, sometimes called an add-drop date, that you probably are all familiar with, where a student takes a snapshot of attendance for a single day, does not cause an institution to become an attendance taking institution under these requirements. So if you have a census date where you're trying to identify what the student is enrolled in and sort of lock down that enrollment, that does not automatically make you required to take attendance. And if you have a program taught in modules, you can have up to one census date in each module without being considered required to take attendance for any period of time. So we want institutions with programs using multiple modules, and if you have only a single census date, we want you to think carefully about that. So what we've seen is that a census date usually happens, let's say, 2 weeks into a payment period, and if a student withdraws later after attending a portion of that module, and they haven't attended enough courses to be let's say a full-time student, they've only attended one course in that module, and then returns to a later module in the same payment period, but you don't have a census date in the later module, what can happen is that the student's new enrollment in the later module is actually not taken into account. So if the student changes his or her enrollment during that period, you're not really able to account for it when you calculate the student's Pell Grant under 34 CFR 690.80. So if you use multiple census dates, again, one per module, you can recalculate the student's eligibility at the second module so that you can ensure that they'll actually get all the aid that they're eligible for. This is just something that we wanted to point out as we went through, because this has been a struggle for certain students when schools only have one census date and more than one module. So an institution that is required to take attendance must use its official attendance records to determine the student's withdrawal date. So this includes instances when attendance is only taken for a limited period, and it also includes cases where attendance is taken for a limited period, but then a student who attends on the last day of period is actually going to be treated as a student who is at a student at a school which is not required to take attendance after that point. As long as, and this is important, as long as the institution can demonstrate that he attended at least one day after that point. And that's because essentially we know that you're taking attendance, let's say, for a 2-week period, and then you cease taking attendance, and that's fine. But we need to know that the student is actually still attending after that they didn't just drop out in the first week, in which case you would need to follow the attendance taking rules. If you can show that he took a quiz, that he had some kind of attendance after that attendance taking period, then when the student later withdraws, you have all the options that you have as a non-attendance taking institution. And we actually highlighted this in the 2010 program integrity rules, and so you can use in those rules. We describe all the different ways that you could identify attendance later. It could be a quiz, a project, even an interaction with an instructor, and we'll talk a little bit about what constitutes academic attendance in just a few minutes. So those are the requirements for schools that are required to take attendance, but what about those who are not? So an institution not required to take attendance is basically any school that doesn't fall into one of the categories for those that are required to take attendance, and that's most institutions. Institutions that are not required to take attendance have more options for determining when a student has withdrawn. For an institution that is required to take attendance, a withdrawal date is the last date of attendance. It's pretty simple. It's based on the institution's attendance records that they have to maintain. The institution, though, must have a process in place to make determinations when a student has ceased attendance, and they have to do so pretty quickly. The last bullet here describes Dear Colleague Letter Gen 0412, and it reminds the school that it has to have a process whereby it makes attendance determinations at least once every 2 weeks. Many institutions plan into their processing cycle a weekly attendance determination if they are required to take attendance. As long as the institution is following its written procedure and doesn't exceed the 2-week limit, it's basically in compliance with this requirement. So for an institution that's not required to take attendance, a student's withdrawal date is one of several things. It could be the date that the student began the formal withdrawal process or provided official notification to the school. It could be the midpoint if the student is an unofficial withdrawal and leaves without notifying you. It could be the date of the student's illness or an accident or something like that, if that applies. It could also be the beginning of a leave of absence if the student never returns from the leave of absence. Or, and this is an important one, it could be the last date of an academically related activity, if you can document that activity. Remember that a counseling session or simply being online no longer meets the definition of an academically related activity, so it doesn't fit into any of these categories. So an institution does have to have a process for determining whether a student completed the period when you determine whether you need to do an RT4 calculation. If a student has a passing grade, a student is considered to have completed the period, so those students will never have to have a withdrawal calculation. If you don't have a passing grade in any course, the institution has to, and you think the student did complete the period, you have to be able to document that the student completed that period in some other way. This can be tricky, and so some schools have created policies that differentiate between failing, completed and failing, and did not complete. So example, sometimes an F denotes a completed but failed, but a W denotes did not complete the course at all. So if a student had 1 F and 4 Ws, the student would have completed, and you can clearly show that in your records, as long as the policy is very clear that the faculty need to differentiate between the two. So this is an area that we've seen some issues come up, especially at large schools, where if schools don't clearly have a very good way of identifying withdrawals, some students who unofficially withdraw may slip through the cracks. So it's an important thing to think about when you're working with academic folks about how the grading works. So again, we're going back to leaves of absence for a moment, but this time with respect to withdrawal dates. So when a student fails to return from a leave of absence, the student's withdrawal date is one of two things. If an institution is required to take attendance, it's the date that the leave of absence began. At an institution for an institution not required to take attendance, it's the date that the LOA began. At an institution required to take attendance, it's the last date of attendance, because it's always the last date of attendance at an institution required to take attendance. Remember that for a student on an approved leave of absence, a Title IV loan will remain in an in-school status for the period of the leave of absence. So, and this is important, when a student does not return from a leave of absence, part or all of the grace period could be used up depending on how long the leave was, impacting when the student will go into repayment. And that's the reason for that disclosure that I mentioned earlier, telling students what the implications could be if he or she does not return from that leave. So it's really important for students to know. All right, so we talked a little bit about academic attendance before, but now I want to dig in a little bit more to this concept. So the regulations provide some examples of the types of activities that can be considered academic attendance or an academically related activity. Even if your institution does not take attendance or is not required to take attendance, you should be familiar with these definitions, because these kinds of activities may always be used to identify withdrawal dates. Remember that this list is not comprehensive, however, so other forms of academic engagement could also be used to identify a withdrawal date, but these are things that we've identified as clearly eligible to be withdrawal dates. I also want to emphasize that in order to be counted as attendance, online interactions with instructors or faculty must be related to the subject matter of the course. So you see that's the last bullet there, the last sub-bullet, interacting online with faculty about a subject matter or to ask course-related questions. A student can always contact a faculty member or vice versa, and they can talk to them. And if the faculty member documents that conversation, so obviously an email would satisfy it, or a written account of the conversation, that could constitute a documentation of attendance under these requirements, but only if the contact is actually about the substance of the course. And that means that you have to document both the contact, so who it was that contacted and who they talked to, as well as the substance of the contact, if you really wanted to use this as documentation. So it's an important consideration. And remember that there's a couple of things that are not considered academic attendance that we will not let you use for documentation of a withdrawal date, and I'm going to describe those in a second, and that's actually one of those things. So these three things here are items that are not academically related activities: living in institutionally provided housing or participating in a meal plan, logging into an online course without active participation, or, as I just mentioned, talking to a faculty member but not about the course. You know, how you doing? You want to have lunch? That's not going to cut it. Or participating in academic counseling or advisement. So those things are not academically related activities, and you cannot use those to document a withdrawal date. So an institution that's not required to take attendance may always use the last date of an academically related activity as the withdrawal date, and this is something we just talked about a moment ago. And remember that in this case, the school, not the student cannot come to you with a term paper and say, this is documentation of my last date of attendance. The school has to document that the activity is academically related and that the student attended or performed the activity, whatever it was. So, for example, a student ceased attending his or her classes without informing the institution and just walked away, so it's an unofficial withdrawal. But they took a quiz after the 60% point, so after the point in the term where the student would have earned 100% of his or her aid. The institution actually has two choices in that case. Choice number one, you could still use the midpoint of the payment period as the student's withdrawal date. You always have that option. It's part of the law that you have the option of using the midpoint. Or you can take that student's test, if the faculty provides it to you, and the date of receipt by the instructor as documentation of attendance and an academically related activity, and you can use that to document the student's withdrawal date later in the term. And because that student will therefore earn all of his or her aid because they're past the 60% point, it's a huge benefit to the student for you to do that if you can identify that documentation. So this is another administrative tool that you have available, and unlike a lot of our other rules, this one you can apply on a case-by-case basis based on what you think is best for the student. So it's something that you have some flexibility about. And now I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Scott.
Thanks, Dave. Now we turn to the concept of date of determination, which is the date that the institution becomes aware that a student has withdrawn. And this has a lot of important applications, all relating to starting the clock for the requirements that an institution is required to do, such as the return, post-withdrawal disbursements, or notifications to the student. For an institution required to take attendance, there are two sets of requirements for when an institution must determine a student has withdrawn. The first one is when the student notifies you that they will withdraw. In that case, the date of determination would be the date of the student's withdrawal or notification, whichever is later. The second set of requirements applies when a student leaves without telling you. In that case, the institution has 14 days from the last date of attendance to determine that the student has withdrawn. Except in exceptional circumstances, if an institution required to take attendance fails to determine that a student has withdrawn within 14 days, the department considers the 14th day to be that date of determination for the purposes of determining the required timeframes for returns. This could lead to late returns if the institution does not have an effective process in place for identifying withdrawals quickly. For an institution not required to take attendance, the requirements of the date of determination are similar to what we just discussed. The requirements for a student who provides notification are the same, but for a student who withdraws without notification at an institution not required to take attendance, there are some different requirements. A school must determine that the withdrawal date no later than 30 days after the end of the earlier of one of the three last bullets here. The payment period or the period of enrollment as applicable, the academic year, or the student's educational program. Within 30 days of that date of determination, the institution must perform the R2T4 calculation, notify the student of any grant overpayment, and notify the student of eligibility for post-withdrawal disbursement of loan funds. The institution must return Title IV funds it has the responsibility to return to the department within 45 days, and the institution must make a post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds directly to the student within 45 days. The institution must also make a post-withdrawal disbursement of grant funds to a student's account or a post-withdrawal disbursement of loan funds within 180 days. And please note that a grant overpayment, as we said earlier, will make a student ineligible for Title IV aid until it is handled. So it's imperative for a school to notify a student as quick as possible. As we discussed earlier, an institution must tally all the Title IV funds that were dispersed or could have been dispersed as of the date that the student withdrew. That total is what is used to calculate the amount of funds that the student has earned. In addition to the Title IV aid that was dispersed, you'd include that aid could have been dispersed if the conditions for late disbursements in 34 CFR 668.164G2 were met prior to the withdrawal date, and those are listed here on the slide. If a student's SAR or ICER contains a comment code that requires resolution in order for the funds to be included as aid that could have been dispersed, the underlying issue must be resolved before the institution performs any R2T4 calculation and in time for the institution to meet any applicable R2T4 deadlines. Please note here that a school may not include as aid that could have been dispersed any Pell Grant funds that, if dispersed, would cause the student to exceed his or her Pell Grant maximum lifetime eligibility. Similarly, a school may not count direct subsidized loan funds that would cause the student to exceed his or her 150% maximum eligibility period for direct subsidized loans as aid that could have been dispersed as well. If a student's total aid, which again is aid that could have been dispersed plus the aid that was dispersed, is greater, then the amount that they earn will also be greater. More funds in your could have been dispersed category could result in a smaller amount to be returned or in a larger post-withdrawal disbursement for the student. And remember here that aid must correspond for the period for which you are doing the R2T4 calculation. So here's some examples. In example A, we have a first-year student that starts class on September 1st and then withdraws on September 28th. That student has a Stafford loan for $1,000 that has been originated but not been dispersed because of the 30-day delay rule. So you would include that $1,000 loan as funds that could have been dispersed. But these funds cannot be dispersed because the student was not eligible due to the fact that they were a first-year student and had not been in attendance for at least 30 days. The institution includes these funds because the institution would have a valid ICER on file and originated a loan before the student withdrew. However, the funds cannot be included in a post-withdrawal disbursement because of the restriction on payments to first-time borrowers who have attended less than 30 days. And here we're assuming that the institution is not exempt from that requirement. In example B, we have a second-year student who starts class on September 1st and withdraws on September 28th and also has a Stafford loan for $1,000. But this time it has been originated but has not been dispersed because of a processing delay or the school's decision to disperse later in the period based upon the borrower's request. Here again, you'd include the $1,000 as funds that could have been dispersed. But in this example, a portion of these funds could be dispersed under a post-withdrawal disbursement because the student is not covered by the 30-day delay rule. And this is essentially the same scenario as the previous slide, except that the student in this example is not a first-time borrower, and the delay in disbursement was for another reason. And in this case, the $1,000 in subsidized loan funds may be included in the post-withdrawal disbursement. In our third example, example C, a student is in a 32-semester-hour program that uses period of enrollment for R2T4 withdrawals and withdraws after completing only 12 hours. The first $1,312 of their loan has been dispersed, So that would be included as aid that has been dispersed. And their second disbursement of $1,313 would be included as aid that could have been dispersed. However, in this example, no additional loan funds can be dispersed because subsequent loan periods cannot be made for students who do not complete the period of enrollment. And here let's assume that this is a non-term program and the student hasn't completed their first payment period, so that second disbursement cannot be made. Remember that a period enrollment calculation incorporates the time frame and therefore the anticipated disbursements for the whole academic year. However, in this case, the student has not yet completed half of the credit hours in the academic year and could not receive that second disbursement at the time of their withdrawal. An institution is required to determine the earned and unearned portion of Title IV aid when a student ceases enrollment prior to the planned completion date of the payment period or period of enrollment. We're often asked if schools are required to complete R2T4 calculations for students who have earned 100% for the period. And the answer is no, strictly speaking, but the school still has to document that the student received all the Title IV funds for which they were eligible and that the student has completed more than 60% of that period. And remember again that to qualify for 100% of the student earning their Title IV aid, they must have completed 60.01% after those rounding rules we discussed. At this point, there are two types of funds. There are earned funds, which is the percentage of grant and loan assistance equal to the percentage of the payment period or period of enrollment that the student completed. For example, if a student completes 10% of their period of enrollment or the payment period, they've earned 10% of their aid for that period. Unearned funds is essentially the complement of that. So that student who earned 10% did not earn 90% of their funds. And again, as we like to stress, again, there are three types of possible outcomes to your R2T4 calculation. The amount of Title IV funds exceeded the amount earned, so it must be returned. The amount of Title IV funds were less than the amount of earned, so a post-withdrawal disbursement must be made, or the two equal. For post-withdrawal disbursements, they must meet the late disbursement requirements established in 668.164G. The post-withdrawal disbursement must be made from grant funds before loan funds. A post-withdrawal disbursement comprised of grant funds may be used to pay the following current charges, as noted on the slide, for tuition, fees, or room and board if contracted with the institution. And as we previously noted, an institution must make post-withdrawal disbursements of grant funds to student accounts within 180 days of that date of determination. And the school must disperse to the student any funds that were not dispersed to a student account no more than 45 days after that date of determination. For post-withdrawal disbursements of Title IV grant funds, no student confirmation is required to pay for current outstanding charges for tuition, fees, and room and board that we listed on the previous slide, or for prior year charges up to $200. Written confirmation is required by the student for all other charges. If dispersed to the student's account for outstanding charges, it must be dispersed within 180 days of the date of determination. And if dispersed directly to the student, it must be dispersed as soon as possible, but within 45 days of that date of determination. For post-withdrawal disbursements of Title IV loan funds, the post-withdrawal disbursements must be made within 180 days of the date of determination. It cannot be a second or subsequent disbursement of a direct loan. The post-withdrawal disbursement of a direct loan cannot be made if the student was a first-year, first-time borrower unless the student completed the first 30 days of the program or was not under that restriction. The institution must offer the student the loan post-withdrawal disbursement within 30 days of the date of determination and request confirmation that the post-withdrawal disbursement is accepted. And the institution must obtain authorization to pay for other than current charges. The required notifications of post-withdrawal disbursements of Title IV loan funds. Within 30 days of that date of determination, the institution must notify the student and explain the borrower may decline all or a portion of that loan disbursement. The institution must request confirmation of any amount to be credited to the student's account or directly dispersed to the borrower. The institution must explain the obligation to repay that loan. And the institution must specify a deadline of at least 14 days for required response or confirmation. If that response is late, the school may decide then to not disperse. And if the school decides to not disperse, then it must notify that borrower in writing. However, if the school does not receive a response from the borrower, then there's no disbursement of that post-withdrawal disbursement for that loan amount. And now I'll turn it back over to David.
All right, thanks, Scott. So now I'm going to talk about some somewhat technical and miscellaneous issues after this slide, which is obviously very important. But there's still important issues that you should be aware of as you're performing R2T4 calculations at your college. So this one is not miscellaneous, and it's extremely important to the return of Title IV process, and that's return of unearned funds. So remember, as we pointed out earlier, if you have funds to be returned as part of the institution's responsibility, you have to do so within 45 days of the date of the termination. And a return is considered to have been made when the institution, number one, deposits or transfers the funds into the school's federal funds account, and then awards and disperses the funds to another eligible student. So it's essentially as if you've taken the funds, put them back in your account, and then given them to another eligible student. Once those things are done, you're considered to have made the return. Your return is also considered to have been made when an institution returns the funds to the department electronically using the refund function in G5. And if you know your business officer's process, the G5 system is the system that brings in Title IV aid to your institution, the actual dollars. So that's the cleanest way probably to send a return back, but it's not the only option. Remember that there is a third option that we actually don't describe on this slide. It is permissible. You can return funds via check to the department, but the option is only available for grant funds because we've ceased receiving checks for direct loan funds as of January 1st, 2015. And if an institution chooses to return funds by check, you must issue the check within 45 days of the date of determination. So it's not an option that we prefer, and probably not one that you prefer, but it is in some very limited cases an option. So another question that you might ask during a return process is what to do with credit balances. So we're going to start with how this works. First, you hold all the Title IV credit balances that you have until the R2T4 is actually calculated. Once an institution is aware that a student is withdrawn, it needs to actually perform that calculation and then determine if there's the student's final charges after you apply any institutional refunds or other refunds that would be applicable, and then figure out exactly how much the student is owed after the calculation is performed. So recall that in some cases, particularly when the institutional charges used in the calculation are low, a student could be left with a grant overpayment after the R2T4 calculation is performed. In these situations, if there is also a credit balance available, you should certainly use that credit balance to pay that grant overpayment down, because to do otherwise could leave the student in a situation where they're not eligible for Title IV aid if you've actually reported that grant overpayment to the department. So it's a very important issue, and you want to be sure that you get those grant overpayments taken care of as quickly as you can, and this is a clear way to do that. And you also need to remember the same rules for credit balances as always apply. You must release that credit balance within 14 days, but in this case, it's within 14 days of the date that you perform the calculation, because we recognize that that's the date that you actually know what the student is entitled to receive as a credit balance. And there's also some items about verification that we wanted to discuss. So if verification is not completed when a return of Title IV calculation is performed, you need to return any interim disbursements of aid that are subject to verification, and you must not include them in the R2T4 calculation. In that case, you would only include a student's unsubsidized loans and plus loans in the calculation. And if verification is completed later, but still within verification deadlines, even if the student does not return to the institution, you still need to perform a new R2T4 calculation with the additional funds included as aid that could have been dispersed. So we would expect you to redo that calculation, get those funds processed as quickly as you can. It may be that you have post-withdrawal disbursements to make if indeed the student completes the verification within the timelines, and the student is still eligible for a late disbursement under the requirements in 34 CFR 668.164. So that's an important thing to remember. When you have a student that dropped out, if they are still in contact with you and they end up completing verification later on, you do need to redo that R2T4 calculation. So I want to spend some time, too, talking about FSEOG, because there's some special considerations for FSEOG and return of Title IV calculations. There are several ways that a school can provide an institutional match for FSCOG awards, and I'm not going to go through each of them because I'm not an FSCOG expert, and so please don't ask me any questions about these. I won't be able to help you. But note that the first two options are the match is performed on each disbursement for the student. And the last one, the match is performed at the institutional level. So there's no way to identify in any given individual's award, there's no way to identify the exact proportion that is federal aid if you match it at the institutional level. And that's important for RTT4 because we have different ways of treating FSCOG depending on which matching option that you use. So if you use one of the two, the individual recipient match or the aggregate match where you're doing matching on the disbursement level, we only expect you to include the 75% of the federal portion of the FSCOG award in the calculation. So you're not going to include whatever money the institution matched of the student's award in the RTT4 calculation. So that's a bit of a benefit to a student. They don't have to have that included in that return. They'll get to have that money still in their account. However, if you use the fund-specific match, which is the one that's performed at the institutional level, you actually have to include 100% of every FSCOG award in the RTT4 calculation, and that's because you can't pull out the amount that was federal and the amount that was institutional of every FSCOG award. All right, so now we're going to go through a case study. We're going to go through a full return calculation and just see how it plays out when we go through the whole process. So I'm not going to go through all the information on this page, but this is our case study for Richard Sherman. He's our student. But let's talk about a few important factors that you'll need to know in order to know how this was going to be performed. The school's academic year is 30 weeks and 24 credit hours. They have a payment period of 15 weeks, and they perform the RTT4 calculation on a payment period basis, and that's because they have to. They're using standard terms. They're not allowed to use the period of enrollment to perform the calculation. The withdrawal type is an unofficial withdrawal, and you can see there's the cost of attendance profile for the student on the left-hand side of the screen at the bottom, and then on the right-hand side of the screen at the bottom, you see the student's Title IV award profile. Don't take too much time to figure out how that award was calculated because you'll drive yourself crazy. But just for example purposes, this is what the award is. Pell Grant, SEOG, unsub. Not sure how that happened, but that's what it is. All right, so some more information about Richard. Richard is brilliant. He's offered a high-paying job by a computer company, and he just walks away. He never mentions it to you, and he's just gone. He's happy. He's happy, so we don't need to worry about him. But we do need to worry about his RTT4. At the end of the term, the institution finds out that he failed all of his classes, and on December 16th, after faculty are consulted, the office responsible for RTT4 determined that the last time that they could document that Richard was at an academically related event was October 10th. The payment period started on September 1st and ends on September 9th. The 50% point is October 20th, and the date of termination is, as we just said before, December 16th when that occurred. So how does this play out for the institution? So step one, you can see the worksheet here. This is the top of the worksheet where we're identifying the funds that are included in the calculation. As we mentioned before, this is a standard term program, so the school has marked the payment period box. You can see that in the middle of the screen near the top. And then note that Richard's entire Pell, SEOG, and direct loan disbursements are all included in the dispersed column of the calculation. And the total of all the funds that Richard was dispersed, or could have been dispersed, which in this case is nothing, is tallied in box G there at the lower right-hand corner of the screen, $6,680 total. So moving on to step 2 and 3, the institution chooses to use the midpoint of the students as the student's withdrawal date because that's the most beneficial to the student. Remember that the student we had documented the student's last date of attendance on October 10th, but that would have been less than 50% of the payment period, so the school chooses to use the midpoint in order to give the student the greatest benefit. That 50% is multiplied by the total amount of aid dispersed to Richard, which we arrived upon in the prior slide, and the final amount that Richard has earned is $3,340. remember that this is the amount that of Title IV funds generally that Richard has earned. And the next slide, we're going to go back and figure out the exact types of funds that are going to be returned. But at this point in the calculation, that's just all the Title IV lumped together. That's the total amount that he has earned. And in this example, he does not have a post-withdrawal disbursement, so we'll move on past that step. All right, steps 4 and 5. Step 4 gives us the amount of Title IV aid that must be returned by the institution. We take the total disbursed, or $6,680, subtract the amount that was earned, $3,340, for a total of, again, $3,340 that must be returned by the institution, or Richard, or both. Then we tally Richard's institutional charges for the period and multiply them by the unearned Title IV aid percentage, which also happens to be 50% because we use the midpoint in this case. And so you can see there that yields a total of $3,250 that the institution is responsible for returning. And if you look at the calculation, you can see all of those items that we talked about in the cost of attendance. These are the direct costs for the student: tuition, room, board, and other. Those were those books that the student had. And you can see here how the lower institutional charges would have resulted in a much lower amount that the school was required to return. So, for example, if Richard had only been charged $2,000 in tuition and nothing else, the calculation would have been $4,500 multiplied by 50%, which would have yielded only $2,250 that the school was responsible for returning, which would have been much lower than what we have here. So then we move on to step 6, actual funds that we're going to return. Here we see the amounts that we're going to return. The total is $3,250, but it's divided between multiple types of Title IV aid as prescribed in the regulations. First, we return the $1,930 in unsubsidized direct loan funds, and then once that's exhausted, the school returns $1,320 in Pell Grant funds for that total of $3,250. In this slide, we're going to determine what to do with the unearned aid for which Richard is responsible. So in this case, Richard is only responsible for $90. But this $90 cannot come out of loan funds because the school's already returned all the loan funds that Richard received. So what do we do with this remaining amount? So in these last steps, this is a portion of grant funds for which Richard is responsible. But in these sets of steps, we see what we call the grant protection being applied. The total grant funds for which Richard was eligible is multiplied by 50%, which yields $2,375. And so unless the amount that Richard is responsible exceeds that amount, so he would have had to be responsible for returning, say, $2,500, and it doesn't here. It's only $90 that the calculation spit out. Richard is not required to make an overpayment, and the school's responsibilities are satisfied as soon as they make those returns of Pell and direct loan funds, and then that will be the end of the calculation. So in these cases, it's rare for a student to have a grant overpayment. We do harp on that because it's an important component of this process. But because of the grant protection, it does not happen very often, again, unless you have very low charges. And then it does happen more often in those cases. All right, well, we're getting toward the end, so everybody take a deep breath. You're almost there. We want to talk a little bit about our software for performing R2T4 calculations. It's the R2T4 on the web software, and that's available on the FAA Access to CPS online website, where the tool can be accessed. You can see we've circled where you can click on it there if you go to the FAA Access website. You can get to FAA Access by signing up on the SAIG enrollment website. Primary DPAs and secondary DPAs can enroll users, add and remove services, and you can set people up to access this that way. The software allows you to create calendars for specific programs. So if you have a standard term program, it's very easy. You would set your start and end dates, identify your scheduled breaks, and then it's automatic from there. You can also create institutional charge profiles, and then you can later update those profiles for individuals if the student has different charges. One thing we do want to mention with this software is that if you end up with a non-term credit hour program, which is always going to be a little difficult for return of Title IV purposes, we didn't get into this too much, but there is a component of return of Title IV for non-term programs that's important. If a student is behind or is not moving as expected through his or her program, you have to extrapolate out the time that the student is expected to take to complete the payment period. So this software, you'd have to create a bunch of different calendar profiles for students in non-term credit hour programs. So it's a little bit more difficult and time-consuming, but then almost everything for non-term credit hour programs is, as probably most of you know. So that's part and parcel for this. This slide here has a bunch of different resources that you guys can use, and this is as much as we could compile of all the different resources that we've given on R2T4, and we'll take you through all the important guidance that we've provided on this topic over the last, it's more than 20 years now, so almost 20 years. And so now we're going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, please come to one of the two microphones and line up, and we'll take questions one at a time. So thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question about post-withdrawal.
Can you speak into the microphone? I couldn't hear you.
I have a question about the post-withdrawal disbursements. If a student was eligible for, say, $10,000, but they accepted less, the part that they didn't accept, originally, yes, they were eligible for that money, but they chose not to accept it. So am I supposed to use what they could have received or what they actually accepted?
The amount that they accepted.
That's what I thought. I just wanted confirmation. Yep. Thank you.
Yep.
We'll go to the back.
Question is in relation to R2T4 and 399. If we performed an R2T4 for 16-17, then subsequently receive a 17-18 ICER with a C code 399, and in resolving the conflict, we find the error was in 16-17, and the student's need changes significantly. What's our timeline for making the R2T4 correction?
That's a good question. I think we need to take that one back. If you want to email us that one, we can chat with you guys. But that's a very good question. I don't think we've established a specific timeline for it. I think right now we would just tell you as soon as possible, but we don't have any designated deadlines. I could say 45 days, but I don't want to give you any specific time frame because we really haven't identified one.
And just as a note, here are our email addresses to email us.
Thanks.
Back up front.
Okay, just to follow up on that, if we do get an answer that has more of a hard deadline, can you add it to maybe the FAQs or something on IFAB?
If we establish a specific deadline, we'll release it as guidance to the whole community. Yes, absolutely.
My question is actually regarding approved leave of absence and standard term programs and retroactive withdrawals. So some of our programs have a tendency to retroactively withdraw a student if they leave specifically for medical reasons. So my concern is that coming back at the point at which they left. If we're retroactively withdrawing them, we're pretending like it never happened. So can we just allow them to start the next term? So if they leave in the fall, could they come back in the winter and just pick up new classes? Because it's like they never started the fall in terms of a retroactive withdrawal?
Well, so this is a very tricky question, and I want to be sure that I make sure that everyone understands. So when you say retroactive withdrawal, I think that, and I want to make sure what you mean. I think that usually means that the institution essentially says, we're going to treat you as if you never attended. So the tuition is backed out, aid is backed out, everything. So for R2T4 purposes, technically, you can't do that. You can't do that if a student earned a portion of Title IV aid for the period.
Right, and we're
still
doing the calculation based on the date that they informed us that they were leaving.
Right. So, you mentioned this in the context of leave of absence.
Yes.
You put the student on a leave of absence and allow them to return in the subsequent term at the same point in the program?
No, that's what I'm asking. Okay. So, if they leave in the middle of fall, they're approved. It's a medical leave, so they are approved to come back in winter. We're on quarters, sorry, and they're approved to come back in the winter or the spring semester. To qualify for an approved leave of absence in this case, would they have to restart where they left in the fall?
They'd have to restart at the point in the fall, effectively. I mean, we're not going to make you get it to the exact day, for example, but you'd have to be very close to the point in the coursework and the point in the term in calendar time where they left off.
But even though for academic purposes we've withdrawn them from those classes, so they're never going to get a grade. So how could they restart halfway through the course if they have to retake the whole course?
Well, I don't think you're going to qualify for the leave of absence,
that's
unfortunately.
What I thought. I really, because we're trying to figure out if we're going to use the approved
I see.
leave of absence.
It doesn't sound like you could qualify in that for that reason. Is
Okay.
that they really have to restart
Okay.
in that case, so they don't have the option of picking up where they left off, and that's the main requirement.
That's what I thought our hang-up would be.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
To the back.
My question goes to distance ed classes.
Yep.
I understand all of the academically related activities, and at the end of the semester, when we determined that the student failed out, didn't complete the classes, they were going in consistently every day, clicking around, and that's not academically related. We also, I guess I'm asking, where are the guidelines that I can look? Because we had a professor that did not accept an assignment because it was 2 days before the end of the term. She clicked in, accepted the class, got the syllabus, then clicked in and out, didn't qualify for anything, and then at the end of the term turned in a late assignment, which was not accepted. It didn't go through the correct channels, didn't go through email, just turned it, through the proper. So in my mind, this student didn't complete the class, but I want to do the correct and the fair thing.
Yeah, so we can't express any specific guidelines for what your institution considers an accepted assignment. So generally speaking, now, are you required to take attendance or not?
No.
So remember that you always have the option of using the last date of academically related activity. So I'm assuming that you're doing that in this case because you're trying to figure out what the last day of attendance was.
And that's what we did. I calculated based on the last date of attendance the professor had of an academic related. I did an R2T4 calculation, returned money, then the student came back and said, no, I finished that class. So we went back to the professor and said, are you sure you didn't receive anything? He found in his email where he deleted and just didn't accept it. And I got guidance from the federal ed that said, yeah, I have to call this money back because it was an accepted academic related. And I'm just trying to get better clarifications where I can send my academic professors or, policy or whatever.
Yeah. So it's a judgment call. I can't give you specific guidelines for how it's going to work in every case because every case is going to be a little bit different. Generally speaking, if a student is submitting an assignment that's related to the course, that's generally an academically related activity, and the student submitted it. If the faculty member produced it, that also meets the requirement for an academically related activity. All of what you described, it seems pretty close to what would constitute an academically related activity that you would need to use to identify the student's withdrawal. Now, you already withdrew them, I think, it sounds like, earlier in the term. Is that right?
Well, this was after
the
process at the end
yeah.
when we gather all those that haven't.
Yeah. So if you find that it was inaccurate and you have better information, we do want you to use the most accurate information as well. In this case, it does sound like it meets all the requirements, but what I want to be careful about is there could be cases where a student submits something that really doesn't meet even the basic requirements for what constitutes an academic assignment. They might just be submitting something that is just a few words or an email or something, and there needs to be your faculty in some ways are the arbiters of whether that constitutes an academically related activity. But if it really was a full assignment and if it was just late and it came in during the payment period, then it does sound like an academically related activity.
Even though nothing was done between the beginning and the end.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Back up front.
My question is about an R2T4 where a student attends J-term and gets awarded their leftover funds, but then they drop out of the spring term on the last day of J-term, but they completed J-term.
Can you define J-term? What's that?
J-term is a 10-day period in January where we combine the term with summer. If it was a withdrawal, it would be January to, instead of the spring semester.
Okay.
Okay, so if the student was just in J term, she would not have earned, because it's only 3 credit hours, she was not eligible for federal aid. She
Well,
did not
she could be Pell eligible unless.
But I'm loans.
Okay,
total
just the loans. Okay.
So she wasn't technically eligible because she did not attend the spring semester. Is it an R2T4, or do we just take her money away?
So she's only eligible for loans. We've established that, right? So she was planning to attend J term in spring.
Correct.
When did she drop the spring again?
She dropped the spring while she was in J term.
But before she finished J term.
Yes.
And she finished J term.
Yes.
In that case, the student completed J term and she completed. That's it.
So she's eligible.
There's no R2T4. Well, she's not eligible because, well, think about this. You never dispersed the student's loans.
We dispersed J term
You did
because she had started J term and
Right.
she was eligible for it. But the
So-
caveat is you have to be in 6 hours, and J term and spring term combined to give you your 6 hours.
Right. So do you make the full loan disbursement at the beginning of J term?
No, just the J term disbursement.
So you make a smaller disbursement of the loan funds in J term, and then you would make a larger disbursement of the funds in the subsequent period.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense. That's a good question. So at the time that the student withdrew, the student was not half-time, and so the student would not be eligible for anything else. The student, and there's no withdrawal. There's no R2T4 calculation.
Right, that
So
part, no.
the student is eligible for the amount of loan funds that she got, and the other portion that she was not half-time at the time of the withdrawal. So there's nothing further to do.
So we don't take the money away from her because she wasn't eligible for it because she didn't complete.
Technically, for direct loan purposes, and this is something that we often get questions about, the requirement is that you are enrolled half-time, and not that you attend all the courses that you signed up for, like Pell. With Pell, you have to attend all the courses that constitute your enrollment status. With loans, you just have to be enrolled half-time, and I'm presuming that she was enrolled in the spring terms courses when she got the loan disbursement.
Correct.
And if that's the case, then she was eligible for that disbursement at that time. So you don't take those funds away, those are hers.
Okay, my second question is kind of on the same road. You have a student who is enrolled full-time for the 6 hours for the fall.
Okay.
10 days before classes, the money's dispersed.
Yep.
Before classes, she drops down to 3 hours.
Okay.
Is she eligible for the money since it was already
She,
dispersed?
same rule applies. When she got the disbursement, she was enrolled half-time, and it's again just for loans. I want to be clear
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
She's eligible for those loan funds. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Before we go to the back for the next question, I just want to let everybody know we have about 5 minutes before we'll have to vacate the room. So just try to speed up the question.
I have a calculation question on the midpoint. So if the payment period is 100 days, then the midpoint is the 50th day, so 50%. But if the payment period is 101 days, does it go to the 50th day or 51st, or do we just take 50%?
It's 50%.
50%.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yep.
Back up front.
So I wanted to get clarification on we're a school that's required to take attendance.
Okay.
It's an institutional policy.
Okay.
Am I required to always use the last date of attendance that's been posted in the student record? Or can we use the academic related activity?
For purposes of the RT4 calculation, those are the same thing. Well, when you say attendance, we do interpret attendance to mean submission of an assignment and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So you should be using whatever the last thing was, whether it's in a class or whether it was submitting a paper or whatever. That's the last date of attendance for us. Yep.
To the back.
Hello. For a school not required to take attendance and using a payment period, if a student enrolls in 2 classes, one's the whole length of the term from August to December,
Okay.
and another one that starts November to December, and the student gets unofficial withdrawals in both classes, where unofficial withdrawal would normally be the midpoint of the entire thing. Because we don't really take attendance, but we have a policy where the school, the first day of the class, the instructors, if they don't show, they get a no-show.
Okay.
So if the student doesn't get a no-show in the class that starts in November, can I use that date, November 1st, as the last day of academic activity?
If you've logged attendance, then now you said they didn't get a no-show.
They did not get a no-show. I'm sorry, if they didn't show up the first day of the class, they get a no-show drop. They get dropped.
Well, no, that's what I understand. So the presumption is that the instructor is always dropping students who don't show up for that class.
For the first
But
day, yeah.
you have to document attendance. You can't just say that I'm documenting. Let me think about how this goes. That the student didn't not show up. That's not that we can't do it that way. So this instructor needs to actually be able to say, I documented the student was here. The fact that he didn't drop the student out of the course is, even though that's generally the policy, you could not use that as documentation of attendance. There has to be something, a positive documentation that the student was there.
So we can't just make the assumption.
I mean, you could use this if the faculty member kept a roster that day, which they would need to do in order to fulfill your policy. You could use that, but you can't just use the fact that the student wasn't dropped to use as a last day of attendance.
So both courses were unofficial withdrawals. How can you determine that the other student's not attending the other course up to that point in time?
Can't.
So you couldn't use the no-show as the last day of attendance because you really don't know when he
Well, right.
unofficial draw on the other.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah. So you really can't use that as a last date of attendance.
So I could.
I mean, like I said, if you have a roster that shows the student was there for a day, you always have that option. But that's really the only way that you could do it, as far as I can tell. Yeah. Okay.
Back up front.
Hi, glad I got here up time. I work, I do R2T4s for a non-term credit hour.
Oh, so you were the person I was talking
attendance
to.
taking. I was wondering if we did an R2T4 calculation based on an LDA that was fed over from extended campuses, but then we later found that the LDA was incorrect, that they were feeding us the wrong information. Do we need to put back the funds and then redo the R2T4 calculation?
Yeah, so when you identify an error like that, we don't specify deadlines, but the expectation is that you just take care of it as soon as you can.
Okay.
So for example, if an auditor came in and saw that you had already taken care of it, it might show up as a finding, but it would already have been resolved, and so that's good for you guys. So you want to just do it as quickly as you can.
Thank you.
Sure.
And our final question.
Yeah, on date of determination, you indicated when we would know that the student withdrew, or like you said, they began the process versus when we find out about the process. So in some cases, our records office, they might get the withdrawal form, but then they have to go get signatures, and then the records office, once it's completed, then that becomes the date they enter in the system. So is that okay to use that date, or we're supposed to know when the student started the process?
So generally speaking, if a student gets that form and signs, so it depends on a whole lot of different factors that you guys would have to look at. But so if you have a form that the student has to submit to someone and the student signs it and says, the form says, I intend to withdraw, something like that, really the day that the student signed it the first time is the day that the student withdrew. But that might not be what the form says. And so I don't want to make a categorical statement about this, because it might be the student says, I'm thinking about withdrawing, or I'm just checking with some instructors to do this, and then I formally withdraw only when everyone has signed, or maybe the student doesn't have to sign it until all the faculty have signed it. So all of those things need to be considered when you think about whether that form could be used.
Okay.
But the point is, it's when the student actually informs you of that intent. And that form, because of the way it's written, may not be enough to fulfill that definition.
Okay, so
That
we can
makes
find
sense?
out from, say, our records office.
Yeah, so
what
I would take a close look at that form and see how that process works, and whether that initial submission of the form by the student or getting the form is really him notifying your offices.
Okay. One other thing, on a Pell Grant, we're a quarter school, so if a student drops, like they're full-time, but then they drop a class, and later on, by the time they actually withdrew, they were less than half-time.
Yep.
So we paid them we reduced everything, paid their less than half-time Pell, and that's the amount we put in the R2T for, not could have been dispersed what would have been full-time.
Well, so I would need to know a lot more about your recalculation policy to know whether that was the right way to do it.
This would have been prior to census. Well, we
Okay,
have a census date.
okay, yep.
And so at the time when we're looking at it, so at the time of when they withdrew, they were less than half time. So we're using now
Yep.
aid that they were eligible for at less than half time, not anything that could have been dispersed.
Trying to remember the guidance that we've given on this. The last thing I remember was that yeah, you would use whatever they were actually in at the time of the withdrawal to identify how much that goes into the calculation. That's right.
Yeah, because prior to that, we would have
Yep,
reduced.
because you haven't gotten to the census date, you haven't established the amounts, et cetera. And they've attended all the courses, I'm
Right.
assuming, but they dropped them as they went. So it's whatever they were in on the day of the withdrawal.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just for the note of time, we are well over the time. I see other people coming in for the next session. So if you still have questions for us, I'd ask you that you either come up real quick or email us after the session.
If the student, I have a question about module. If the student completes the passing grade for module 1 and then never attends module 2, can we use the last for the withdrawal date? Can we use it as the end of module 1, or can we use the final exam date?
Well, yeah, you have to use, if you have a final exam date, you should use this.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Final exam date, we would have to look it up though.
Yeah.
But you can't just use the date that you think the term ends, because the student might not have attended all the way through, and you just don't know. So, but if you have an exam date, and you know that you took an exam, that's fine. You can use that.
And then going on with the drop form, if the student indicates in our drop form, you said if they submit that they're gonna stop attending on this date, they submit a letter. But what if they put it on the drop form that they stopped attending on this date and